Okay, I'm going to start by making a series of statements, and as I make them, I'd like you to think about how many times you've heard statements like these, whether or not you've said things like this yourself, and then really think about whether or not you believe the things that I'm saying. If winning doesn't matter, then why do they keep score? Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. Second place is the first loser. In the words of Ricky Bobby himself, if you ain't first, you're last. Now, the last one wasn't an actual person. But the next quote that I'm going to put on the screen is, in fact, it's from one of the most accomplished golfers in the history of the sport. And I want you to notice the language, because I think it's important. Nobody ever remembers anybody who finished second at anything. Very extreme, very exclusive language, I think. Nobody, ever, anybody, anything. I mean, is it really that serious? I think it's time that maybe we asked ourselves if our collective obsession with being the best, whatever that is, maybe produces larger social problems that we're not aware of. That maybe we don't see the connection between the two. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of value in competition. Sometimes, at least in the short term, I think it could be a good means of self-improvement. If I think I'm pretty good at something, and I see somebody else doing it better, all right, that person and I are going to interact somehow, maybe even compete against each other. And by that model, I might use that other person as a means of individual improvement. So I think that we can all think of examples where competition does in fact work. But there's an underlying assumption to the competitive ethic that I think needs critical analysis. What it says is this: the most effective means of making the most of human potential is by putting people against each other. To me, that seems counterintuitive. It seems cynical. And I think I have an idea as to why. I think ultimately, when we get to a hyper-competitive state, that we have an element of dehumanization to the competitive environment. I mean, think about it. If we all, and I think we all have a basic human need for validation. We all want to feel like we're okay no matter what. But if we say to ourselves and to each other that your individual validation, your means of becoming who you want to be, has to come at the expense of somebody else, how can you naturally view that other person when that other person is an obstacle to you becoming who and what you want to be? Naturally, we can't think of that other person as a person in the same way that I'm a person. They're an obstacle. They're in the way. I don't think that's reaching. So there's a good deal of developing research, I think, that augments that point. We've known for decades that poverty creates certain stressors on people. And those stressors create things like low levels of, we die earlier, right? More violent crime, more theft, okay? But if this is a TED conference, so I'm assuming at least some of you have been familiar with some of the research done by Richard Wilkinson. He's given a TED Talk. He's produced a lot of papers. And one of the things that he indicates is that it's not just poverty, the stress of poverty that creates this situation. It's when we have socioeconomic inequality. When we have an environment where we have the haves and the have-nots, there's not a whole lot in between, we add the element, I think, of competition. And when we do that, that's an even greater predictor of those sorts of social problems than poverty by itself. I think it's pretty telling. Now, before I even was exposed to the Wilkinson research, a student of mine last year who's graduated now, in an assignment, showed me a research study that he found. And it's from Dr. James Kirkbride at the University of Cambridge. And he links high rates of schizophrenia to high rates of socioeconomic inequality. To me, that was pretty powerful. I've always thought that mental illness was a product of biology, of physiology, of your brain chemistry or whatever. But there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that it's not that simple, that your environment is at least as important as your biology in determining your mental state. Now, think about this, and if you go back and look at the study, and I really suggest it, the margin of increase is really only 4%, and that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but think about it in global terms. How many thousands or tens of thousands of people could have otherwise maybe lived, relatively speaking, mentally healthier lives and happier lives, were it not for the intense gap and the social competition that's created by that intense gap? I would also argue that even when we win, maybe sometimes it turns us into something that we would rather not be. Last year, there was this upscale high school in New York called Stuyvesant High School, and they were embroiled in a cheating controversy. The superintendent of 13 years was fired. 66 students were suspended. Now, this is a very upscale school. It's highly competitive. To get into it, you've got to place really well on 8th grade standardized tests. And the reason the staff was involved in the allegations, if you go back and look at the report, was the staff themselves, they were complicit in the cheating. Now, we could think, well, that's just those people at that one school, right? Well, think back to what happened in the spring in Atlanta Public. That's a huge public school district. Same sort of thing went on. And we can see quantitative evidence to back that up. The Josephson Institute of Ethics in 2009 released a study, and in that study, 51% of kids 17 years of age agree with this statement, that it was morally acceptable to cheat if it could get you ahead in life. Now, I've seen this in my own profession. I remember early on in my teaching career, I've got 9th grade English kids sitting there, and they're taking a test, and I've got one kid, he raises his hand, he needs my help, and as I walk over to see what he needs, I look at his hand, and he's got answers written on the very hand he's putting in the air to get my attention, okay? Now, I had a problem, because I liked this kid, and I thought he was a pretty good kid. So I've got a choice here. I can either moralize the situation and say, well, he just must not be a good kid. I thought he was, but he's a bad kid now. Those people at that high school are bad people. People at Atlanta Public, bad people. Those kids, those 51%, I guess are just bad people. But to me, that's too simple of an explanation. I don't think it gets at the real truth. If I've learned anything in almost 2 decades of teaching and coaching, I've learned this. You can try to control people coercively and say, if you do this, I'm going to do that, and you're going to have to sit in detention or whatever coercive sort of consequence you give. But if you really want to influence people in a positive way, what I have found is the only thing that can really be effective is by altering that person's environment. And why are we surprised when this sort of thing happens? When our environment is overly competitive. We shouldn't be. Now, as an example of the merits of collaboration, let's look at some of the recent developments in the last couple of years in cancer research. For years, researchers worked in isolation of one another, competing against one another. You make a name for yourself, you get funding, you get more research, you make a career, right? Well, they've created these dream teams, and you feel free to look it up. SU2C stands for Stand Up to Cancer. At some other point, look it up. It's pretty interesting stuff. But there are 2 researchers I want to talk about specifically, Dr. Peter Jones and Stephen Balin. They're researchers in epigenetics. Now, I don't have time to go into what epigenetics is, okay? But for years, decades, they competed against each other. 3 or 4 years ago, they start putting together these cancer research teams. And they've made more strides working together than they ever made separate from one another. In fact, one researcher on a separate team, because there are a bunch of these teams, said that he thought it was unrealistic to develop a drug and get it to market in 3 years' time. Couldn't be done. In the 3-4 years that they've been doing these dream teams, they can get it done in a year. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, these are heavily funded research teams. I'm sure that's at least part of the explanation. But I can't help but think that at least half of the results they're getting are a result of the collaborative model they're using. I'll let you decide for yourself. Now, let me backtrack a little bit, because I'm not saying that we should do away with competitive athletics. I'm not saying that we should give a ribbon to every single kid just for showing up. But I do think that we owe it to kids to let them know that the ribbons that they're getting aren't really meaningful. They're pieces of cloth. Trophies are pieces of plastic. And medals don't have any more meaning than what we give to them extrinsically. They are extrinsic motivators. And if we're honest with ourselves, let's ask ourselves this. If we've got to give kids extrinsic motivators to get them to go out and do well at something, do they really want to do it, or are they doing it for us? If you've ever been at a youth sporting event, you know what I'm talking about, right? So ultimately, I think people are going to compete. I'm going to. I've been coaching high school football for 18 years. I've got 3 kids. They're going to. So that's not what I'm advocating. What I'm saying is we need to keep 2 things in mind when we do decide to compete. Number 1, the outcome does not affect who I am or how valuable I am. We should not internalize failure any more than we internalize success. It's simply what happens. It's not who I am. And the second thing is this, and I think this is really the core of what I mean by collaborative competition. We need to learn to think of our opponent as our ally, not as our adversary. Now, that might sound counterintuitive to some of you, but think about it. If we really believe in competition as a means of individual improvement, then I need that person over there, because it's that interaction between the 2 of us that makes us both better. And if I somehow look at that person as an obstacle rather than as a person just like me, I think we compromise our humanity. Thanks for listening.